The phone rang at 2:14 a.m., and Arif almost let it die. He lay in the dark of his cramped apartment, one arm flung over his eyes, the ceiling fan ticking above him like a metronome counting down to nothing. Grease was still caked under his fingernails from a 10-hour shift at the garage. His daughter, Tythee, slept in the next room, her nightlight throwing a thin gold line under the door. He had learned, in the 2 years since his wife died, that nothing good ever came from a call at this hour. But the ringing didn't stop. It clawed at him, insistent, desperate. He answered on the 5th ring, voice rough with sleep. "Hello." For a moment, there was only breathing, shallow, panicked, uneven. Then a woman's voice broke through, cracked and trembling. Blake, please, I can't breathe. Something's wrong. I need you to." "This isn't Blake," Arif said quietly. Silence. Then a sharp, humiliated gasp. "Oh God. I'm sorry, I must have. Wrong number. I'm so sorry." She was already pulling away, already reaching to end the call, when he heard it, a sound that stopped him cold. A thin, involuntary whimper of pain, swallowed hard, the kind of sound people make when they're trying not to fall apart in front of a stranger. He knew that sound. He had made that sound himself, once, in a hospital hallway that still visited him in his dreams. "Hey," he said, before he could stop himself. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she lied, and then her voice buckled entirely. "I'm not fine. I'm alone, and I think something's really wrong, and I don't know who else to call." Arif closed his eyes. He knew exactly where this road led. He had sworn, standing outside a hospital room 3 years ago with his wife's hand going cold in his, that he would never walk through those doors again for anyone. Hospitals took things from you. They didn't give them back. And yet, he sat up, feet finding the cold floor. "Where are you?" "What? Tell me where you are." "I'm coming." "You don't even know me," she whispered. "No," he admitted, already reaching for his jacket, already glancing toward Tythee's door with a guilt he couldn't name yet. "But you called someone in the middle of the night because you were scared. That's enough." He didn't know, as he stepped out into the cold and started the car, that this one decision, answering a stranger's fear instead of hanging up, was about to cost him everything he thought his life was supposed to be. The hospital doors slid open with a hiss, and Arif's chest tightened before he'd even crossed the threshold. The smell hit him first, antiseptic and stale coffee, the same smell that had soaked into his clothes the night his wife stopped breathing. His legs almost refused to carry him further. He forced them to. He found her in the emergency waiting area, curled into a plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own body together. She was pale, trembling, dressed in clothes too fine for 2 in the morning, a coat that probably cost more than his car. When she looked up at him, her eyes were glassy with fear and something else, something like disbelief that a stranger had actually come. "You're real," she said weakly. I thought I imagined you." "I'm real," Arif said, sitting down beside her, careful to leave space, careful not to crowd a woman who had no idea who he was. "What's your name?" "Nazia," she whispered. Nazia Chowdhury. The name meant nothing to him then, not yet the name attached to boardrooms and satellites in a company that touched half the world without most people knowing it. In that moment, she was just a frightened woman clutching her side, waiting for blood test results, a private nurse rushing between machines because Nazia had refused, even in her panic, to let word reach the wrong ears. No family beside her. No assistant. No one. Arif didn't ask about her illness. He didn't push. Instead, he stayed. He fetched water when her hands shook too badly to hold the cup herself. He sat through the long silences, through the moments she pressed her palm to her chest and breathed like she was counting seconds until it passed. Somewhere around 4 a.m., exhaustion cracked her open, and she asked him, voice small, "Why did you come?" "You don't know me." He thought of his wife's last months, the fear in her eyes that no one else had been willing to sit with, the nights he'd wished, more than anything, that someone would simply stay. He thought of Tythee, 7 years old and already learning what loss felt like far too young. Because someone should have answered when it mattered, he said simply. For me, no one did in time. Nazia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand a kindness that came with no strings, no cameras, no angle. She didn't know yet that this stranger sitting beside her, still smelling faintly of engine oil, would soon be the only steady thing standing between her and the people circling to take everything she had built. For now, she only knew one thing. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing the dark alone. Morning arrived with a different kind of shock. Arif had barely dozed off in the plastic chair when the doors of the private wing swung open and a small army moved in. A personal physician, 2 assistants speaking in clipped, urgent tones, a security detail that hadn't existed the night before. Someone had finally been told. The transformation was instant. The frightened woman from the waiting room was gone, replaced by someone the staff addressed with a reverence Arif had only ever seen on television. Ms. Chowdhury, a nurse said, practically bowing, the board has been notified. Mr. Kabir is asking. Not now, Nazia said, but her voice had already changed too, steadier, sharper, armored back into place. Arif stood quietly by the window, out of place in his worn jacket among tailored suits and hushed urgency. It was only then, listening to fragments of conversation, that the pieces clicked together. Everhart Aerospace. Board of Directors. Billions in market value. The woman he'd sat beside all night, wiping sweat from her forehead with paper towels from a hospital dispenser, ran one of the most powerful companies in the country. She caught him staring and read his face perfectly. Embarrassment flickered across hers. Raw and unfamiliar. A woman used to controlling every room suddenly caught without her armor. I should have told you, she said stiffly. It doesn't matter now. An assistant appeared at her elbow with a checkbook already open, as if summoned by instinct alone. Nazia glanced at Arif, then away, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to do, but doing it anyway. The only language she trusted in moments like this. For your time, and your discretion. Arif looked at the number scrawled on the check. It was more than he made in 6 months at the garage. Enough to fix the leak in Tythee's bedroom ceiling. Enough breathing room he hadn't had in years. He didn't take it. I didn't come for money, he said quietly. I came because you were scared and alone. That's it. Everyone wants something, Nazia said, guarded, almost daring him to prove her wrong. Not me, Arif answered, already turning toward the door. Take care of yourself, Miss Chowdhury. He walked out past the marble-floored lobby, past cars worth more than his entire life, back to his 15-year-old sedan in the parking garage, back to a daughter waiting for breakfast and a world that made sense to him. He didn't look back. He didn't expect to ever see her again, but Nazia stood at the window long after he'd gone, staring at the empty check still resting untouched on the table, struck, for the first time in years, by someone who had wanted nothing from her at all. 3 days later, Nazia walked into Everhart Aerospace headquarters wearing a tailored blazer sharp enough to hide the tremor still living beneath her skin. Glass walls rose 40 stories above the city, catwalks of steel and light, a monument to everything her grandfather had built from nothing. She had spent her entire adult life proving she belonged inside it. Today, for the first time, she felt like a guest in her own house. She sensed it before she saw it. The way conversations died as she passed, the way eyes flicked toward her and then away too quickly. By the time she reached the boardroom, she already knew. Sadman Kabir was waiting at the head of the table, hands folded with the calm precision of a man who had already won a fight no one else knew was happening. He rose to greet her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nazia, glad to see you're recovering. I'm fine, she said, taking her seat, refusing to let the word crack. Of course, Kabir said smoothly, though the hospital visit raised some concerns. Understandable ones, given the circumstances. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, medical disclosures she had never authorized to be shared, a leaked report questioning her fitness to lead, and a formal motion, drafted, notarized, ready, proposing an emergency vote to install an interim CEO while she focused on her health. The room around her seemed to tilt. 20 years of building satellite networks that reached villages no one else bothered to connect. 20 years of proving, again and again, that she deserved the name on the building. And now a single hospital visit was being weaponized to erase it all. "You can't do this," she said, low and controlled, though her pulse hammered. "We're not doing anything," Kabir said, spreading his hands in mock innocence. "The board simply has a fiduciary duty to ensure stable leadership. Investors are nervous. Rumors travel fast, Nazia. Faster than truth, usually. Since when do rumors override a majority shareholder?" "Since the bylaws your own father signed," Kabir said quietly, "allow for exactly this vote when the board has reasonable concern about the CEO's capacity. You know this. You helped write it." She did know it. That was the cruelest part. "The vote is scheduled for 3 weeks from today," Kabir continued, standing, buttoning his jacket like a man closing a deal already settled. "I'd suggest you use the time wisely. Prove you're stable. Prove you have support. Otherwise, the board may not see a reason to wait." He left her alone in the vast, glass-walled room, the city glittering silently beyond the windows, indifferent to the empire quietly slipping from her hands. 3 weeks. That was all she had to prove she wasn't the fragile, dying woman they wanted the world to see, before everything her family had built for 3 generations was taken from her by men who had never once answered a call in the middle of the night for anyone but themselves. The garage smelled of motor oil and burnt rubber when the black car pulled up outside, out of place among the rusted fences and cracked asphalt of Arif's world. He didn't need to look up from the engine. He was elbow deep and to know something had shifted. He felt it in the sudden hush of the mechanics around him, in the way his boss straightened his cap and muttered, "Hassan, you got a visitor." Nazia stepped out in sunglasses too large for her face, as if trying to disappear inside her own image. She looked steadier than the woman from the hospital, but there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. The look of someone counting days on a clock she couldn't stop. "I need your help," she said, without preamble, once they'd stepped into what passed for privacy behind the garage. "I told you," Arif said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I didn't do it for a reward." "This isn't a reward. It's a job." She hesitated, and for a woman who commanded boardrooms, the hesitation looked foreign on her. "The board is trying to remove me. They're using my health as a weapon, painting me as unstable, alone, falling apart. I need to prove I'm not falling apart. I need people to see I have someone steady beside me, someone the press can't twist into a scandal. You want me to pretend to be your boyfriend. I want to pay you to be my partner publicly. Appearances, events, enough to convince the board and the shareholders I have support. Nothing more than that." She named a figure, and the number hit the air between them like something physical. Enough to move out of the leaking apartment. Enough for the surgery Tythe's pediatrician had mentioned in passing, the one Arif hadn't let himself think about because he had no way to pay for it. Enough, maybe, to finally breathe. Arif turned away, staring out at the row of half-dead cars waiting to be resurrected, thinking of his wife, of the vow he'd made never to let anyone use him again for what he could provide rather than who he was. This felt like exactly that. A lie dressed up as a favor. "I don't lie for a living," he said quietly. "Even for money." "I know," Nazia said. "That's exactly why I'm asking you. Everyone else in my life has an angle. You're the only person who's ever wanted nothing from me." He thought of Tythe's small, brave smile despite the pain she hid so well. He thought of what her future could look like with this money, safety he could never build fast enough on his own. "For my daughter," he finally said. "Not for you. Not for the money. For her." Nazia nodded, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "That's enough for me." The first gala felt like stepping onto another planet. Arif stood beneath a chandelier that probably cost more than his apartment building. wearing a suit Nazia's stylist had chosen without asking his size, feeling like an imposter in every mirror he passed. Photographers called Nazia's name, and she answered with a practiced smile, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a gesture rehearsed in her townhouse the night before, and yet, standing here now, it didn't feel entirely like performance. "Just breathe," she murmured through her smile, for his benefit as much as her own. Let them see what they want to see. What they wanted to see was stability. A grounded man. A woman who wasn't crumbling. And slowly, over weeks, the illusion began to work. Headlines shifted from speculation about her health to curiosity about the mysterious mechanic who'd captured the heiress's attention. Arif learned to navigate boardroom small talk, learned which fork belonged to which course, learned to stand beside Nazia in photographs without flinching at flashing cameras. But more than the events, more than the performance, it was the quiet moments that started to unravel the boundary between the role and the reality. A shared laugh over bad hotel coffee, an unguarded look across a crowded room that lasted a second too long. At home, an unexpected second thread was weaving itself into their arrangement. Tythee, curious and unafraid in the way only children can be, had taken an immediate liking to Nazia. What began as awkward small talk over dinner turned into afternoons in Nazia's private study, where she discovered the girl's sketchbooks, pages filled with hesitant, beautiful drawings Tythee had never shown anyone outside her father. "You have a real eye," Nazia told her one evening, turning the pages with genuine wonder. "Has anyone ever taught you properly?" "We can't afford lessons," Tythee admitted, matter of fact in the way children speak of things they've already made peace with. By the following week, a small stack of proper art supplies had appeared at their apartment. No note, no announcement, just quietly left, the way Arif had once refused a check. Watching his daughter's face light up over a set of Real watercolors did something to him he hadn't expected. This wasn't in the contract. This felt dangerously, wonderfully real. Not everyone was fooled, though. Across town, in a glass office far removed from sketchbooks and gala floors, Sadman Kabir studied surveillance photos of the couple with narrowed, calculating eyes. His assistant hovered nervously by the door. "Should we push harder on the health disclosures, sir?" Kabir didn't answer immediately. He was staring at an old photograph pinned inside a folder marked private. A photograph that had nothing to do with hospital records or board bylaws, something older, something that predated Nazia's illness entirely. "Not yet," he finally said, closing the folder. "Let them build their little fairy tale a bit longer. It'll make the fall so much more interesting when it comes." Whatever secret sat locked inside that folder, it was clear his war with Nazia had never truly been about her health at all, and time, quietly, was still running out. The collapse came without warning, the way storms sometimes wait until you've stopped watching the sky. Nazia was mid-sentence in a strategy meeting when the room began to tilt, her vision fracturing into fragments of light before darkness swallowed her whole. She woke hours later to sterile white ceilings and the low hum of monitors. Arif's face the first thing she recognized, drawn tight with a fear he wasn't quick enough to hide. "Aplastic anemia," the specialist explained gently, once she was lucid enough to understand. "It's progressed. Your bone marrow isn't producing what your body needs anymore. We're past the point where medication alone will manage this." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You need a transplant. Soon." The words landed like a verdict. A transplant meant weeks of vulnerability, a body stripped down and rebuilt, no guarantee of a donor match, no guarantee of survival, even if one was found. It meant stepping away from the company at the exact moment the boards circled closest, handing Sadman Kabir precisely the vacancy he'd been engineering all along. "I can't disappear right now," Nazia whispered, more to herself than anyone in the room. "Not with the vote 3 days away." "Your life matters more than a boardroom seat," Arif said, low and fierce, gripping her hand like he could physically hold her to the earth. She wanted to believe that was simple. It wasn't. Everhart Aerospace wasn't just a company to her. It was every promise she'd made to her father, every village waiting on satellites that only her leadership had fought to fund. Losing her health and her legacy in the same breath felt like a cruelty designed specifically for her. Then the second blow landed, faster and colder than the first. A tabloid story broke overnight. Anonymously sourced, suspiciously well-timed, splashed across headlines within hours. Dying heiress's mystery boyfriend revealed as broke mechanic. Insiders say he's after her fortune. Photos of Arif's modest apartment sat beside photos of Nazia's estate. Financial records twisted into implication. A narrative engineered with surgical precision. Buried in the article, quoting an unnamed source close to the family, was language eerily close to legal terminology, enough to suggest a custody of assets challenge was already being prepared behind the scenes. Arif read it standing in the hospital hallway, his hands trembling with a rage he rarely let himself feel. His name, his daughter's photo cropped from a school event he barely remembered being photographed at, dragged into a story that made him look like exactly the kind of man he'd spent his whole life refusing to become. "They'll use this against you," Nazia said weakly from the hospital bed, guilt cutting through her exhaustion. "The board, the investors, they'll say I have no judgment left at all." "Let them try," Arif said, though even he didn't fully believe it yet. Somewhere across the city, Sadman Kabir read the same headline with quiet satisfaction, closing his laptop like a man who had just moved the final piece into place, unaware that the very weapon he'd unleashed was about to force both Arif and Nazia to prove something no leaked story could fabricate. 2 days before the vote, a lawyer Arif had never met arrived at his apartment door with an offer that made his stomach turn. $5 million, the man said, sliding a folder across the kitchen table like it was nothing, like the number itself wasn't obscene. "In exchange for your signature confirming, on record, that your relationship with Ms. Chowdhury was a paid arrangement from the start. It protects everyone. Cleaner exit for you, cleaner narrative for the board." Arif looked at the folder, then at Tythe's watercolor paintings drying on the counter beside it. Nazia's gift, still damp from that morning. $5 million. Enough to erase every hardship he'd ever known. He thought of the leaking ceiling, the surgery he could finally afford outright, a life free of counting pennies. He didn't touch the folder. "Get out of my apartment," he said quietly. The lawyer blinked, caught off guard by a refusal that made no financial sense to him. "You understand what you're turning down?" "I understand exactly what I'm turning down," Arif said. "Tell whoever sent you that I'm not for sale." "I never was." 2 days later, he stood in the same glass boardroom where Nazia had first been ambushed, this time beside her, not behind her. Weak from her declining health, but unwilling to face this fight from a hospital bed, Nazia addressed the board directly, her voice steadier than her body. "Before you vote," she said, "there's something you should know about the man orchestrating this campaign against me." She nodded to her legal counsel, who placed a new folder on the table. The real one this time, obtained through weeks of quiet forensic accounting Nazia had commissioned the moment the leaked story broke. It detailed a series of shell transactions tracing back to Sadman Kabir, revealing he had secretly shorted a significant position against Everhart Aerospace stock months before her diagnosis became public, a bet that would only pay out if her leadership collapsed and the company's value cratered under interim management he controlled. The room went silent. Kabir's practiced composure cracked for the first time, color draining from his face. "This is absurd," he managed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You didn't leak that story to protect the company," Nazia said. "You leaked it to protect your own investment in watching me fail." Arif said nothing, letting the truth do what no payout ever could. He simply stood there, steady and unmoved, exactly the kind of stability Kabir had accused him of faking. Proof, finally, on full display, of something real. The board's vote, when it came minutes later, wasn't the one Kabir had engineered. It was unanimous, and it wasn't for him. Security escorted Sadman Kabir from the building that afternoon, his name already being stripped from company records. While outside the glass walls, Nazia allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to simply breathe. The transplant was scheduled for the following Monday, and by then, Nazia had nothing left to prove to anyone but her own body. The board fight was over. Kabir was gone, his name already fading from the glass halls he'd once ruled with quiet menace. But victory in the boardroom meant nothing against the battle now waiting inside her veins. A donor match had been found, a stroke of luck her doctors called rare, almost miraculous, and there was no more time to delay, no more crises to hide behind. Just Nazia, a hospital bed, and the long, uncertain road of rebuilding a body from nothing. Arif was there before the sun rose on the morning of the procedure, sitting in the same kind of plastic chair where this had all begun weeks earlier, though nothing about this vigil felt like an obligation anymore. He held her hand as they wheeled her toward the operating room, and when she looked back at him, frightened in a way no boardroom battle had ever made her, he didn't offer empty reassurances. "I'll be right here," he said simply. "Same as last time. I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed tested him in ways the galas and press conferences never had. There was no illusion to maintain here, no audience to perform for. Only the raw, unglamorous reality of watching someone he loved grow weaker before she could grow stronger. Fever spiked in the night. Her body rejected, briefly, painfully, before beginning slowly to accept what had been given to her. Arif learned the rhythms of the ward, the language of blood counts and engraftment, sitting through silences heavier than any he'd carried since his wife's final days. But this time, he didn't run from the hospital's ghosts. He sat inside them, and somehow, that made all the difference. At home, Tithe filled the empty hours with color. Without being asked, she began a new painting each day, taping them one by one to the wall of her bedroom until it became a quiet mural of hope. Sunrises, open fields, a small house with 3 figures standing outside it holding hands. When Arif finally photographed the wall and showed Nazia during a moment of lucidity, tears slipped down her face before she could stop them. "She did all this?" Nazia whispered. "Every day you've been in here," Arif said. "She says it's so you don't forget what you're coming back to." It was such a small thing, a child's paintings taped to a wall miles away, and yet it did something medicine alone couldn't. It gave her a reason beyond survival, something worth healing for. On the 14th day, her counts began to climb steadily for the first time. The color slowly returned to her face. Doctors who had spoken in careful, guarded tones started allowing themselves small, real smiles. Arif stayed through every step, not because a contract demanded it, not because appearances required it, but because somewhere in the wreckage of hospital nights and boardroom wars, this had stopped being an arrangement entirely. When Nazia was finally strong enough to sit up on her own and asked, weakly, half joking, whether he regretted any of it, Arif only shook his head. "I stopped keeping score a long time ago," he said. "This was never about what I'd get out of it." Outside the window, spring was arriving, indifferent and beautiful, promising both of them a future neither had dared to plan for. 6 months later, Nazia stood on a launch platform in the desert at dawn, wind pulling at her hair, watching a rocket she had fought through hospital beds and boardroom betrayals to see reach the sky. The Everhart satellite constellation lifted off exactly on schedule, a controlled column of fire and thunder rising against a pale morning sky, carrying with it the promise her grandfather had first dreamed decades earlier. Broadband reaching villages, schools, and clinics that had never before had a signal to call their own. It was more than a business milestone. It was proof that connection, once nearly stolen from her, could still be delivered to those who needed it most. She had returned to full leadership 3 months after the transplant. Her recovery slow but steady, the board reshaped by shareholders who no longer trusted men like Sadman Kabir to whisper in dark corners. His name was now attached to ongoing investigations rather than boardroom seats, his shell companies unraveled thread by regulators who had been quietly alerted the same week his scheme collapsed. The empire Nazia's family had built was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely, unquestionably hers. Arif watched the launch from beside her, No press cameras trained on them today, no performance required. It had been months since anyone needed convincing that what stood between them was real. The tabloids had long since moved on to other scandals. Their manufactured story about a gold-digging mechanic replaced quietly, almost embarrassingly, by profiles calling him the quiet foundation behind one of the industry's most remarkable comebacks. Neither of them had bothered correcting or embracing the narrative. They knew what it actually was, and that had become enough. Tythe stood between them, no longer sketching in secret notebooks, but attending weekend classes at an art program Nazia had quietly funded for children across the city. Not just her own, a detail Nazia had insisted on, unwilling to let her healing become only about one family when it could ripple outward the way the satellites above them now did. Tythe's latest painting, framed and hanging in Nazia's office beside decades of aerospace awards, showed three figures standing beneath a sky full of stars, holding hands. As the rocket disappeared into the clouds, Nazia turned to Arif, her voice quiet beneath the fading roar of the engines. "Do you ever think about it? That night, if you'd just hung up the phone." Arif considered the question the way he considered most important things, slowly, honestly. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to letting it ring out. Why didn't you?" "Because somewhere, someone needed to answer," he said simply. "It just happened to be me." There was no grand declaration between them, no dramatic promise shouted over rocket engines. Just his hand finding hers the way it had that very first night in the hospital, steady and certain, and her fingers curling into his without hesitation, the way they had learned to over months of storms weathered side by side. Above them, the satellites climbed higher, carrying connection to places the world had almost forgotten. Below, two people who had found each other by mistake stood quietly rewriting what they'd once believed love, loyalty, and second chances were supposed to look like. Proof that sometimes the most important calls in life are the ones we never meant to answer.